Good evening to everyone.
Erev Tov.
Erev Nehedar. Good to see everyone.
So we still have 4 minutes to go, or maybe it's 3.
Hi, everybody. Can we put on some Tu B'Shvat music, maybe? it's so quiet. It's supposed to be Tu B'Shvat. How about some Tu B'Shvat songs?
Go ahead.
I know, but I don't know how to share it, unfortunately. I can do it on my phone, but I can't.
Just sing.
Oh, I'm not going to sing, but yeah. Were you able to hear it? I'm not even sure you were able to hear it, were you?
We heard.
Again? One more time. Okay, I'm sorry, but I was asked to do an encore. It's not even my song.
Hi, how are you, Atira? What was that?
That was pretty good.
What happened to the music? I didn't see anybody dancing, by the way. I don't know.
I think it might have been switched off to prevent that possibility.
True, it's a time for celebration.
I think we can commence the proceedings in a moment. Just one administrative note. Please mute yourselves and stay muted until such time as, I don't know, the speaker might invite you to unmute, because we can hear everything. You know, if you scratch your nose, we can probably hear it if you're unmuted. It's better not to. Welcome everyone to the Harav Yisrael Tu B'Shvat extravaganza with our own Harav Yosef Ote, and all the fruit you can eat, provided you supply it yourself. I think with that, I will turn over to Harav Ote, and with the request again that you mute yourselves if you don't need to be speaking. Thank you, Harav Ote.
Mitsuyan. Wow, thank you so much. So, Morai Verabotai, so good evening to everyone. I want to start first by thanking Irene Grossman and of course the Dubovs, as usual, for setting up this wonderful lecture and making sure we have a Zoom address and getting it out there. Same thing goes with Irene and her family. So thank you so much. This is our 4th consecutive year celebrating Tu B'Shvat together. In the past, we sat down and ate a beautiful seudah, delving deep into the meaning behind the various foods and the brachot that we make upon them. But unfortunately, this year, we're unable to continue this tradition. So hopefully, in the future, the near future, next year, we will be able to return to the lovely meal together. It really is a time for a celebration. Instead, so I've divided my Tu B'Shvat Seder into 2 parts. Tonight, I'll give an overview of the Mitzvot Hatluyot Ba'aretz with some very interesting history as well. And tomorrow, Be'ezrat Hashem, at 7 p.m., which is Mamash Leil Tu B'Shvat, we were going to begin with a L'chaim. And I hope everyone received the PDF and the JPEG, asking everyone to bring a cup of wine or grape juice or whatever you want to make a L'chaim with. And that will be around 7:05 or so, something like that. And of course, immediately afterwards, we'll have a fun game with questions for everyone to answer regarding Tu B'Shvat. And I tried to come up with interesting questions with the intention of outdoing last year's. If you remember, we had a very nice game last year as well. So let's hope we can succeed. And tomorrow will last around a half hour altogether, not more than that. So without further ado, let's jump right into today's topic, which is the magical mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz, and we'll explain what everything is. The Torah was given to Am Yisrael to be taught and observed in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore the brachot will continue to flow to and from Eretz Yisrael to the whole world. There are lots of sources regarding that special, unique aspect of Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz Yisrael, Malchut Hashem is truly revealed. And from Israel, we know this, that the beauty and wonder spread to the whole world. While in Chutz La'aretz, they're more difficult to discover. It is possible, but it's harder. There's a famous Gemara in Masechet Kiddushin that says, 10 kabin of wisdom, 10 kabin yardu la'olam, descended into the world. Eretz Yisrael took 9 of them, and the rest of the world took 1. So in other words, those who live in Eretz Yisrael can truly understand the depth of the Torah and its wisdom, more than a person who lives abroad. So from here, it's very clear that Eretz Yisrael has a very special status. Chazal teach us that the mitzvot connected to the land, to the soil, karka de Eretz Yisrael, should be practiced and observed only in Eretz Yisrael, whereas commandments that are independent of the land, Shabbat, and many other mitzvot, most of the mitzvot, that are not dependent on the land of Israel, they must also, of course, be fulfilled in the Galut as well. However, the reason given by the Ramban, for instance, and many other really great Rabbein, he gives it on the Torah in Vayikra, Perek Yudchet, if you want to look it up, Pasuk Kaf Hey, gorgeous, a beautiful commentary, is that by keeping the Torah and mitzvot in Chutz La'aretz, we won't forget the mitzvot. That's the reason to be Mekayim them in Chutz La'aretz. And the Yerushalmi, the Gemara Yerushalmi in Masechet Shevi'it, which is all about Shemitah, it adds another reason, because the mitzvot in Chutz La'aretz help us remember to return to Eretz Yisrael. So it's really all about Eretz Yisrael. The Ramban continues to write there that the land of Israel is so important that Hashem himself watches over it. Unlike any other country, in the world. And that is the precise reason why the Sifri teaches us that Mitzvat Yeshuv Eretz Yisrael is equivalent to all of the commandments. Mitzvat Yeshuv Haaretz Shkula Keneged Kol HaMitzvot. So let's go into all these mitzvot that we're talking about. Mitzvot HaTluyot Ba'aretz, the mitzvot that depend on the land of Israel. So I'm just going to go through them, and then we'll go. We'll take the time to really understand what they are. So the mitzvot are as follows: Chala, Orla, Kilei Zra'im, Kilei HaKerem, Chadash, Leket, Shichecha, Pei'ah, Peret, Olelot, Bikurim, Trumot U'Maasrot, Reshit Hagez, Shevi'it, and Yovel, and some poskim add Matanot Hazroa, Halechayim, Ve'Hakeva. That's it. Now, if you add those up, you'll get to 18. Chai. Amazing. So, although some of these commandments that we're going to go through very soon extend to include also Chutz La'aretz as well, like for instance, Orla is also observed in Chutz La'aretz because of Halacha Moshe Misinai. But there's a very clear difference from a halachic point of view between the Orla in Israel versus the Orla in Chutz La'aretz. And the same thing goes, for instance, with the mitzvah of Chadash, new. We'll explain what that is. But even in this case, the mitzvot, these mitzvot that we'll learn, were instigated only when Am Yisrael entered Eretz Yisrael. So although it is observed, some of them in Chutz La'aretz, its root, the roots are planted, pun intended, in Eretz Yisrael. Now, besides those, there are many other public commandments that depend on our country, Eretz Yisrael, such as creating a judicial system in Eretz Yisrael. We don't do that in Chutz La'aretz. And many more that depend, of course, on the construction and existence of the Beit HaMikdash. Now, a very important point is that our obligation in fulfilling all of these mitzvot, hatluyot ba'aretz, also depend on the people of Israel. And this began only after the people of Israel entered Eretz Yisrael through Ever HaYarden. So in effect, all of us that are living in Eretz Yisrael right now are contributing something much, much bigger than the mere fact that we live here. There's a lot more going on in Eretz Yisrael. There's a kedusha that we'll learn about that we can't see, but we can feel if we try to, and it all exists because we live in Eretz Yisrael. Besides just the fact that the soil, the karka itself, has holiness to it. So as we will see, some of these mitzvot, like for instance, Trumot and Maasrot, depend not on just having Am Yisrael live here, but that a majority of Jews live in Eretz Yisrael. And even more so, next year, as all of you know, Tafshin Pei Bet is going to be a Shnat Shemitah year. And the laws of Shemitah and Yovel specifically depend on all of the people of Israel living in Eretz Yisrael. But not only that, each Shevet and their Nachala. So let's delve into these mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz, and then when we're done, we're going to delve into the history of how Am Yisrael, what they really did during the course of time. So let's talk with chala. Chala is the small portion of dough that we tear off and burn or discard before baking any bread, usually chala. We know that this exists also when we say Bameh Madlikim. It's a very important mitzvah. It's one of the important mitzvot that Nashim mekayem, but not only Nashim, anybody who bakes bread needs to have this portion of dough torn off. Now, originally, when we gave this portion of dough as a gift to a Kohen, and he would eat this after baking it, of course, and making it into a pita or to a lachmaniyah, but only when he's in a state of purity, of tahara. Why? Why does a Kohen have to be in a state of tahara, pure? And why do we even give it to a Kohen? So the Kohanim were dedicated. They dedicated their lives to work for Am Yisrael. They were shlichei Hashem, but also our shlichim. And they represented us in the Beit HaMikdash. So in effect, we want to show them our appreciation by giving them a small portion of our dough before we bake bread. In essence, we're showing these Kohanim that we're sharing in their holy work. We too are part of their Kedusha. We take care of them. So this separation of challah, we call it hafrashat challah, separating, which is a part of the fundamentals of food, dough, challah, chita, seorah, all the 5 dganim. It teaches us that everything that we have comes from Hashem. And that it's not just for our use alone. You know, our wisdom, the money that we have, our good health should always be used towards the bettering of Klal Yisrael and the world. So essentially, it enables us to see the bigger picture. Challah. The next very important mitzvah is Orla. Orla, let me just mute everyone, I apologize. Okay, so the mitzvah of Orla. Now, the word Orla, where does it come from? So we just read it not long ago in Parashat HaShavua, in Shmot, in Va'era. It comes from Arel, like Moshe Rabbeinu. He says, Va'anochi aral sfatayim. So Orla comes from aral sfatayim. What does it mean? It means a person whose lips are sealed from talking. That's what Moshe was saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's also Arel Lev, someone whose heart is sealed emotionally, can't feel. So we were commanded that the fruits of the first 3 years be sealed to us. We would not be able to eat them or enjoy the first 3 years of the fruits. So, as we said, the first 3 years after a tree is planted, we're not allowed to eat its fruit. But fruits produced by the same tree in its 4th year, following the 3 years of Orla, they're called Neta Revai, from the word Revi'i, Neti'ah Revi'i, the 4th year from the Neti'ah, from planting. Now, those fruits that come out after 4 years, they're holy and are eaten only in Yerushalayim by us, b'tahara, when we're pure. But they can be redeemed with a pruta, thereby transferring the kedusha to a coin, so that the fruit can be eaten regularly. Now, in addition to this isur achila, orla fruits may not be used for any type of benefit. Asur behana'ah, they are orla atum, sealed in every way, eating and any other hana'ah. We can't enjoy them either. Still, only the orla fruit is forbidden, while the tree itself may be used. So it's all about the fruit. Now, there are a couple of reasons given for this mitzvah of orla. The Rambam, in Moreh Nevuchim, in his 3rd chelek, Perek Lamed Zayin, he says, Lehatzil mita'ut avodah zara. There was a practice in, I guess, which idol worshippers use fruits during the first 3 years for their worship. So the Rambam says we cannot be like them, and therefore we have to distance ourselves from their customs. By the way, the Rambam says that about a lot of things when it comes to avodah zara. The Ramban Nachmanides al HaTorah brings another 2 reasons. Before we enjoy our own fruit, we must thank Hashem. Simple hakarat hatov. That's it. Hakarat, thank you, Hashem. But the first 3 years, he says the fruits are not mechubad enough. Hence, we wait 3 years. And then on the 4th, we are makdish the fruits to Hashem by eating them in Yerushalayim. That is neta revai. And then on the 5th year, we can eat them regularly. So according to this interpretation, when we finally eat our fruit, it's intertwined with our faith, and our connection to Hashem becomes much stronger. And we will give vitality and add favor and blessing to the world. Hence, the fruit of Eretz Yisrael really does bring down the Shekhinah. It's really something very special in Eretz Yisrael. The second reason the Ramban gives is that it's just not healthy to eat fruit before their 4th birthday. He was also a doctor. He was a medical doctor, the Ramban, besides being a Kabbalist and a brilliant scholar and a huge Talmid Chacham. There's also a really beautiful reason given by Harav Eliezer Melamed in his book, Peninei Halacha. He says, Orla teaches us restraint. You know, the ability to hold back instant gratification and delay the satisfaction that we get of having something immediately is a prerequisite for our success in this world and in the next. So, for example, it's known that a person who will study diligently in his youth will do better in his personal life and livelihood. And yet, many young people fail to restrain themselves, blindly jumping, following their instinct, and losing their time in various outings. They go out a lot instead of being at home and learning Torah, for instance. Recently, I heard about a disagreement between the Haredi world and the Kippah Sruga world. That the Haredi world is in yeshivas learning Torah all day long, whereas the Kippah Sruga world, they learn Gemara not enough, and they only wake up when they finally get to Yeshivat Hesder or Yeshivat Gvura. Had they start to learn seriously when they're younger, maybe they can produce Gdolim. So I'm not going to argue about whether we have Gdolim or not Gdolim, but that's a very, very important aspect of really seizing our time that we have. Also, there are people who can't resist spending their money on luxuries, and many times they buy more than they can afford. They fail to save money to acquire a profession or get married, help their children, and sustain themselves in their older years. You know, Adam Harishon, Adam and Chava, was also seduced by his Yetzer into sinning because he did not hold back from eating from the tree of knowledge, good and evil, Tov v'Ra, causing him and his descendants, us, all of us, to be mortal. So through the mitzvah of Orla, we learn to see our fruits grow without immediately enjoying them. And in doing so, we learn to overcome our Yetzer and practice self-control. Just watch them grow. Watch the beauty of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Don't jump to really pick it right away and eat it right away. Let it grow. See the magnificence of this world. So that's Orla. We have Kilei Zera'im and Kilei HaKerem. We were commended. Thank you. We were commended. I'm just going to mute everyone. I apologize again. Okay.
Later.
We were commended.
Hear
Not,
No.
I'm muted. I apologize. So we were all commanded not to sow or plant two different kinds of seeds together in Eretz Yisrael. Rather, each species to itself. Sadecha lo tizra kilaim. There's no reason given for this in the Torah. Much like para aduma. Why can't I? It'll be great. We can come up with these great ideas. So the Ramban, Nachmanides again, says that mixing two different species is a defiance of heaven. For doing so, he says, signifies that there is something missing in God's creation, as if we humans can complete the creation. Rav Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, Rav Kook, explains this prohibition of Kilei Zra'im and Kilei Kerem is something that should teach us not to think that we can control nature like God, but rather that our role is to enjoy nature as God created it. So we may build upon it, creating and inventing with the wonders that Hashem gave us, but it is not our job to repair or mend already perfect creations. The teva, the nature, is perfect. So mixing similar seeds is allowed, since that's not making something completely new and unnatural. Another mitzvah is chadash. We all know chadash because the Chtam Sofer coined chadash asur min haTorah. Nothing new is allowed, right? He was trying to save the Jewish people in Europe. But chadash is something else. Before we're allowed to harvest or eat from our new crops, we must first bring an offering to Hashem from the new grains, specifically seorah. We rely so much on our ability, our intelligence to make it in this world. But of course, parnasah is from Hashem. So, Motzei Chag Rishon of Chag Pesach, we bring an offering from all of Am Yisrael, thanking Hashem for all that we have, that will sustain us in the near future. Only after we thank Hashem, we gave Hashem Hakarat Hatov for the Parnasah. Only then are we allowed to katzir, to cut down our crops and eat from our crops. Otherwise, we're not allowed to. It's specifically designed for Hakarat Hatov. It teaches us Hakarat Hatov. The next couple, I'll put them together, of mitzvot atluyot ba'aretz is leket, shichecha, pe'ah, peret, and olelot. What are these? So let's go through them. We're commanded to share with the poor our blessings, our crops, the source of our parnasah and food. That's really what those mitzvot are. Sharing with the poor. There's no such thing as ownership when it comes to food or even when it comes to money. When people ask me questions about tzedakah, I always say to them, and they talk to me about how much they have, what they don't have, how much they're supposed to give, what they made. I always say, if their mindset is that they don't own any money whatsoever, it doesn't belong to them. Rather, Hashem is allowing them just to keep it in their bank account, but it doesn't belong to them. They're given money to use for good things, for food, for shelter, for clothing, but their obligation is to help those who don't have. Hashem is giving us food and money so that we can have it for ourselves and share it with others. That's really what these mitzvot are. We leave them, when we have crops, we leave them, these poor people, some fruit in the corner of our field. That is the mitzvah of pe'ah. Making sure that if I have a great, beautiful land and great crops, I leave some for them because it's not all mine. Some of it belongs to them. And Hashem says that is your obligation. That's what Eretz Yisrael is all about. It's sharing. It's being one group of people. Achdut. And even more so, if a little of the grain or the fruit during harvesting or collecting is forgotten, we are to leave it for the poor. You can't say, oh my God, I forgot something in the back. No, you can see that you forgot something, but you don't go back and retrieve it. We're not allowed to go back and pick them up. That is mitzvat shichecha, forgetting. Now, how amazing is that? We actually get a mitzvah for forgetting. Halevai, we will get a mitzvah for forgetting where we put our keys, right? We get a mitzvah for forgetting something. You forget it in the field, leave it there, you get a mitzvah for that. The more you forget, you can't intentionally leave it there. That's not called forgetting. Forgetting is just really forgetting, and you get a mitzvah. How is that possible? So it's possible that the schar mitzvah that we receive is not really for forgetting the shichecha. Since someone who is so focused on his crops and is trying as hard as he can not to forget even one small grain, he's invested too much in materialism. If he doesn't forget even one small grain because he looks everywhere, he's invested too much. So maybe the Jew living in Eretz Yisrael simply is more focused on other things like Torah and Ahavat Hashem, needing to run to shul or set the table for guests. And that is the real reason he gets schar mitzvah, that we are preoccupied with Torah in our minds, that we don't look at every little spot to make sure we don't forget everything. It's beautiful. Hashem says, if you're so focused as not to leave any little grain, there's something wrong with you. Yes, it's important to make sure that you pick everything up. But if you forget something, it means that you were not focused only on materialism. That's beautiful. The mitzvah of shichecha. The next two are leket and peret. If individual crops or fruit, such as grapes, fall from our hands, we're actually holding in our hands, walking, and some grapes fall, or some crops fall. They fall down during our harvest. They should be left, you don't pick it up, they should be left in place for the poor. Olelot means leaving tiny clusters of grapes for the poor as well. Why clusters? It's more mechubad. They shouldn't have to just pick up one grape at a time. Leave them some clusters. It's so much more important that when you give be'ahava, you give mechubad. Again, all these are talui be'eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael that's what it's all about. Another one we all know about is bikurim, bringing the first fruits to the Kohanim in the Beit HaMikdash. This is an idea similar to Chadash. People came to Jerusalem dancing and singing, and it was beautiful. The next ones are Trumot and Ma'asrot, a mitzvah that forces us to take care of the Kohanim, the Leviim, and the poor before we eat our new fruits. We're taking care of people. It's divided into four. There's Truma Gdola. So anytime I have fruits and vegetables and I want to eat them for myself, wait a minute, you got to take care of the Kohanim, the Leviim. What are they called? Truma Gdola is given to a Kohen who may eat the fruit only while he's pure. Then there's Ma'aser Levi. It's given to a Levi. And from that portion, we give a bit more to the Kohen as well. It's called Trumat Ma'aser. Now, these on 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 4, and 5 of the Shemitah year, right? Shemitah year is 6 years. So out of the 6th year, year 1, 2, 4, and 5 are what we do is we take a portion for ourselves and we eat it in Yerushalayim. In order to do so, we too need to be in a state of purity. So if we want to eat from our fruits, we give some to the Kohen, to the Levi, and then 4 times every 6 years, we also take some for ourselves, and we go down to Yerushalayim, and we eat it there, taking Hashem, having a celebration with our family, rejoicing with the Kohanim and the Leviim, coming to Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh. How amazing it is that most of us right now are living in Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh. Well, it used to be that Hashem devised these mitzvot to cause people to want to come to Yerushalayim. So what happens on year 3 and 6 of the Shnat HaShemitah? It's a different type of Ma'aser. It's a Ma'aser Ani, giving to the poor. Now today, we can only really give to the Levi and to the poor. Since we are all Tamei Met, we cannot fulfill the mitzvah of Truma Gdola because a Kohen is Tamei Met. We don't have a Parah Duma. And also, we cannot fulfill Ma'aser Sheni as well. So therefore, today, we do the Hafrashat Trumot U'Ma'asrot a little bit differently. You can open your Sidur. There's usually instructions of how to do that. There's something called Reshit Hagez. We must ensure that the Kohanim have clothes. There's also something called Matnot Hazroa Halechayim Ve'Akiva, giving the Kohanim parts of meat from our Korbanot. And then we have Shemitah and Yovel, which everybody knows what that is. Every 7th year, we cannot work the land, etc. Those, in a nutshell, is really the version of all of those mitzvot that are tluyot be'eretz Yisrael. Now I want to ask a question. When did all this start? So, from the time Am Yisrael entered Eretz Yisrael, crossing Ever Yarden, the time of Yehoshua bin Nun, we became obligated, a chiyuv, to fulfill all of the mitzvot commanded upon individuals. What are the individual mitzvot? So let's think about it. Chadash, Orla, Kilei Zraim, and Kilei Hakem, because it has to do with what I need. I want to have my fruit. I need Chadash, Orla. I cannot plant Kilaim. It's for me, an individual. It doesn't have to do with everybody. It's a very individual mitzvah. Now, the commandments given to the public, like Trumot u'Ma'asot, giving to the Kohanim, to the Leviim, to the Aniyim, Mitzvat Shevi'it, Yovel, when did they become obligatory? Only after Am Yisrael finished conquering the land. And not only that, conquering the land, then dividing it into tribes. So it was two stages. The individual mitzvot, when we crossed Ever Yarden, and the actual Karka de Eretz Yisrael became holy, and we were mitchayev with these mitzvot. But only after the kibush of Eretz Yisrael, which, by the way, lasted 7 years, and then the division of Eretz Yisrael into the tribes, another 7 years. So only after 15 years of their entry into Eretz Yisrael, they started counting Shemitah, the Shemitah years, and the Yovel. So if we do a quick calculation, basically, the first year of Shemitah was 21 years after Am Yisrael entered Eretz Yisrael. And on the 64th year, they held the first Yovel, the Jubilee. Now, until the time of Beit HaMikdash, which was much long after that, what did Am Yisrael do? There was no Beit HaMikdash. We just mentioned Maaser Sheni, Beit HaMikdash, and Bikurim, and so many things that we have to do. But what did they do when there was no Beit HaMikdash? So the fruits of the Maaser Sheni, for instance, were eaten near the Mishkan in Shiloh. And that's where they would bring the Bikurim as well as the first fruits. How long did that last? It continued for 369 years of the Mishkan's existence. Now, the Mishkan, those who learned Nevi'im Rishonim, the Mishkan was moved to Nov and to Givon. Okay, Nov and Givon for another 57 years until the Beit HaMikdash was built, and the Beit HaMikdash stood for 410 years. That's based on the Gemara and Zvachim, all these calculations. It's amazing. So only after what, 369 years, another 57 years, then we got to the Beit HaMikdash. Now, there's something very interesting that happened, because when the tribes of Israel were exiled, which was about 150 years before the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, the laws of Shemitah and Yovel were abolished. 150 years before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, we couldn't do the mitzvah of Shemitah and Yovel. Why? It says in Vayikra, Ukratem deror ba'aretz lechol yosheveha. What does lechol yosheveha mean? Yovel and Shemitah exists only in a situation in which all of Am Yisrael lives in Eretz Yisrael, and not while some have been exiled. So once there was an exile, even the Shnai V'Chetzi Hashvatim in the beginning, we couldn't be mekayem the mitzvah of Yovel and Shemitah. However, since most of Am Yisrael still remained in Israel, they weren't all exiled at once, Trumot and Ma'asrot and other mitzvot were still in effect. And out of habit, they still fulfilled the Shemitah commandments, but only as a custom, not as a chiyuv, because it was no longer from the Torah, because the Torah was very, very exact. All of Am Yisrael have to be in Eretz Yisrael. Then, about 18 years after the first 2.5 Shvatim were exiled, when more of Am Yisrael were exiled, listen to this, it's so sad. All of the mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz ceased to be in effect, since by that time, most of Am Yisrael was no longer in Eretz Yisrael. They were spread out all over the Babylonian Empire. So there was no more mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz. And after the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, this was about 132 years later, the country shook. The country yelled out, and it cried. The Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael was destroyed as well. We forget about that. We forget about the karka, the soil. There's a lot of midrashim that talk about the fact that Admat Eretz Yisrael speaks to us. Well, it was crying. It's not just Am Yisrael leaving to exile, but we left it desolate, and the Kedusha was gone. So therefore, all public mitzvot that stemmed from this Kedusha were no longer possible. For example, Chala, and all those donations, the Tumot U'Ma'asot given to the Kohanim, Levim, and the poor, it was all lost. Now, since these commandments depend on the state and well-being of Am Yisrael, the Chiyuv was batel, nullified, void, after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And as the Gemara on Masechet Chulin says, Kedusha Rishona Kidsha Lishe'ata Velo Kidsha Le'atid Lavo. שהקדושה הראשונה התבטלה עם חורבן בית המקדש הראשון. The first kedusha, the initial consecration in which Eretz Yisrael was sanctified during the era of Yoshua bin Nun in terms of the obligation to fulfill land-based mitzvot, sanctified Eretz Yisrael only for its time, but did not sanctify it forever. However, the private commandments that were fulfilled by each individual for himself, like Orlah and Kirai that we mentioned, they were still obligatory from the Torah perspective, even after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash and the exile of Israel. This is their obligation, stems from the entering of Eretz Yisrael. In those cases, it's the land that counts. So there's two parts to it. There's the land, and there's Am Yisrael in the land. Now, how could we live this way without these mitzvot that teach us how to care for one another? So therefore, in the late days of the first Beit HaMikdash, after the exile of Yehoiachin, when a community of exiles began to form in Babylon, the prophets decreed that the fruits that grow in Bavel are also now mechuyav be'afrashat trumot u'ma'asot. Why? How can they do that? How can they be mitaken? That now communities in Bavel are mechuyav be'trumot u'ma'asot. Well, the reason they came up with was because they're close to Eretz Yisrael. They're near Eretz Yisrael. This directive had two reasons. It was intended to preserve the values of the mitzvah among the exiles by helping the poor. We don't want to just neglect the poor. It actually helped. Am Yisrael were always me'uchadim. We always helped. But perhaps these tikunim also, they feared that there would be Jews who would prefer to leave the country, Eretz Yisrael, to escape the duty to take off that 20% or so of crops for Trumot U'Ma'asot. Therefore, they proclaimed that Trumot U'Ma'asot is obligatory in Babylon as well, because they were trying to connect them to Eretz Yisrael. And since there's no Shemitah in Bavel, it was decreed that even on the Shemitah year, there is Hafrashat Trumot U'Ma'asot and even Ma'aser Sheni. 32 years, 32 years after the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, Koresh, the king of Persia, gave Am Yisrael permission to return to Eretz Yisrael and build a new Beit Mikdash. Amazing. You would think trumpets were taken out and people were parading and dancing. But only 42,000 people volunteered to immigrate to Israel. So sad. Now, these immigrants settled in and around Jerusalem because nothing else was built. It was all demolished. And they started building the Mizbeach and the altar, right? Preparing to build the Beit HaMikdash. However, following hate letters sent by the nation's Gentiles, known as the Shomronim, to the kingdom of Persia, the construction of the Mikdash ceased for 18 years, until Daryavesh, who I think was the second son of Achashverosh and Malkat Esther, according to the Gemara and Megillah and Rashi there, they allowed Beit HaMikdash to be built. However, the national and spiritual situation of the Jewish people was still at a low. The vast majority of the people preferred to remain in exile. And the Jewish settlements in the country was small and spiritually dull. So only few people learned Torah, and many commandments were not performed at all. Kohanim, priests, sinned, and they started marrying foreign women. How is it possible? Because they probably thought that in the new reality in which the people of Israel were scattered amongst the Goyim, and just like they knew that a lot of mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz couldn't be fulfilled, maybe they thought that all of Torah mitzvot was no longer mandatory to observe the commandments. It didn't come from lechachis. It didn't come because they didn't believe in it. They thought that just like mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz, all of mitzvot now do not need to be fulfilled. The mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz were so important. It tied us to the land, but it also tied us to the rest of Torah mitzvot. It was clear that a new era was necessary to determine how the Torah could continue to be fulfilled in Israel and in Chutz La'aretz. So in the 6th year of the construction of the Mikdash, a giant among giants emerged from Babylon. Who was he? Ezra HaSofer. He began to inspire the people to observe the Torah and the mitzvot. Ezra's greatness is relayed to us by Chazal many places, specifically in Masechet Sanhedrin, in Daf Kaf Aleph Amud Bet. It says, "Ra'ui haya she'ezra shetinaten Torah al yado, ela shekidmo Moshe." Ezra HaSofer was worthy of giving Am Yisrael the Torah, but Moshe Rabbeinu had already preceded him. He was a huge gadol. Even more so, in the Gemara and Sukkah it says, "Mikshenishtakcha Torah miYisrael arla Ezra miBavel v'yesta." Ezra ascended from Babylon and reestablished the forgotten laws. In addition to being wise, he was also a prophet. And according to the Gemara and Megillah, his prophetic name was Malachi. Hanavi Malachi was Ezra. 13 years after Ezra made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, his buddy Nehemiah, who was a government official in Babylon, immigrated to Jerusalem as well, with the authority from the king of Persia. And together, Ezra and Nehemiah established the Jewish community in Israel, both nationally and religiously. So in order to establish the Torah in Israel, Ezra founded the largest and most important Jewish court in the history of Israel. Our Knesset Yisrael is named after HaKnesset HaGdolah, the Great Assembly, which had members of 120 wise men, among them the last of the prophets. And that's why we have 120 Chavrei Knesset. This court of Ezra examined the state of Judaism and established regulations by which the people of Israel could exist even when it was dispersed all over, some in Israel, but most of them abroad in the exile. How can we bring them back to Eretz Yisrael? So among other things, the members of the Knesset HaGdolah established the nusach of prayer, the blessings, brachot, times reading the Torah, etc. Now, one of the harsh manifestations of the crisis that befell the people of Israel Following the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, as we mentioned, was the abolition of the obligation to observe the public commandments that depended on the land of Israel. Mitzvot tziburiot hatluyot ba'aretz. In the 7th year of the founding of the Mikdash, Ezra, with his court, consecrated the land to allow these public commandments to be fulfilled. He began to count again the years of Shemitah and Yovel, and then all the mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz once again became an obligation. Chazal teach us that the first sanctity, in terms of the obligation to fulfill the land-based mitzvot, sanctified Eretz Yisrael for its time only, but did not sanctify it forever. That was during the time of Yehoshua bin Nun. But a second kedusha to the land in the days of Ezra HaSofer remained for good, because it is said in the Torah that after we sinned and punished with exile, Hashem will bring us back to our country again. If you remember, we say this every Shabbat. Veshav Adonai Elohecha et shivutecha verichamecha, Veshav vekibetzcha mikol ha'amim asher hefitzecha Adonai Elohecha shama. And then it says, Ve'viacha Adonai Elohecha el haaretz asher yarshu avotecha virishta. From the words asher yarshu avotecha, we learn about the first inheritance of Eretz Yisrael and the first kedusha from the time of Yehoshua bin Nun. That means asher yarshu. What does virishta mean? Virishta, we learn about the second inheritance, the second kedusha in the days of Ezra HaSofer. And the Gemara in Masechet Yevamot teaches us that since there is no other mention in the entire Torah that there's going to be a third inheritance, just those two. So by virtue of the second inheritance from Virishta, the land will remain sacred for good, even after the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. So, while there are some Rishonim, the Rashba, the Ran, the Ravid, who disagree, and they think that the second Kedusha is also void, the accepted halacha and the majority of the poskim is that the second Kedusha is never undone. It remains forever. The Rambam provides a middle opinion to all of this, which is that although the second Kedusha is not void, it's not, it's still valid, but certain mitzvot, hatluyot ba'aretz, depend also on a majority of Jews living in Eretz Yisrael. So, for instance, the mitzvah of Trumot u'Maasrot ends up being a derabanan obligation and not deoraita. And that is how we practice it today. An interesting point, which we will not discuss, we won't go in depth, is regarding this second Kedusha, was based on the people, the settlements. It applies to all the places that there were Israel settlers during the second Mikdash period. So therefore, we have two types of borders. We have a border called Olei Bavel. When the Babylonians came to Yerushalayim and then Le'at they expanded, they even expanded to living in Syria. Then Syria becomes part of Eretz Yisrael and the Kedusha. That's called Gvul Olei Bavel. It's very different from the first Kedusha. When Am Yisrael crossed over Ever HaYarden, that's called Gvul Olei Mitzrayim. And there's a machloket, the dispute. What is the koach of the Gvul Olei Mitzrayim versus Gvul Olei Bavel, whether it's deoraita or derabanan. But it is agreed upon that the people of Anshe Knesset HaGdolah rededicated the land and re-sanctified Israel, thereby committing themselves to the observance of public commandments that depend on the land, including Trumot u'Maasot, and hence there will be no need for a third sanctification. We don't need to sanctify it again. We are living today in Eretz Yisrael HaKedosha. However, the Amoraim and some of the Rishonim were divided in their opinions. Are Trumot u'Ma'asrot de'oraita or derabanan? In the opinion of many Rishonim, at the time of the Knesset Hagdolah, before the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, Trumot u'Ma'asrot were de'oraita. But after the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, some say that the chiyuv from the Torah remains in place, like Rashi and the Ravid, but others say it's midirabanan. And the Rambam accepted that the chiyuv of today's mitzvot hatliyot ba'aretz, in general, are from the Torah. But he claims that specifically Trumot u'Ma'asrot, which require that most of Am Yisrael be living in Eretz Yisrael, is midirabanan, and until such a time that we have most of the Jews living here, it will become deoraita. And that is a hint to what I'm about to say, is how can we change that? We can have the majority of Am Yisrael living in Eretz Yisrael very soon. Either way, at the time of the third and final inheritance of the land of Israel, when there will be a majority of inhabitants, of Yehudim, living in Eretz Yisrael, all of a sudden, mitzvot hatliyot ba'aretz will be an obligation from the Torah without need for further sanctification. What's the difference between the chiyuv of derabanan versus the chiyuv of deoraita? Why should it matter? We have to do it either way. I'll tell you in a minute. Just want to finish one more point. Shvi'it. Shvi'it is the Shemitah year. So just to go back and explain that Shemitah and Yovel, now that we understand the two Kedushot, most of the Tanaim agree that 150 years before the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, when the king of Persia, when the Melech Ashur exiled the tribes, Reuven, Gad, and Chetziah, Menashe, we no longer were able to Mikayem Shemitah and Yovel, because only when all of Am Yisrael is in Israel, each Shevet in his Nachala, can we actually be committed to Shvi'it. Therefore, the second sanctification, the Kedusha Shniyah, activated by the Great Assembly, these members during the second Beit HaMikdash, was only strong enough to mandate that the Shemitah and Yovel be performed miderabanan and not from deoraita, because we're lacking all of Am Yisrael living in Eretz Yisrael. Even after the destruction of the second temple, the duty to keep the seventh year of Shemitah is indeed a chiyuv, but a chiyuv from a derabanan state. But since they were successful in ensuring that there will be no need for a third sanctification, all that is necessary to change these mitzvot to deoraita is that all Jews come to Israel. That's all. It is very simple. There's one more thing that we should discuss: gifts to the poor. Mitzvat leket, shichecha, pe'ah, peret, olelot, which are left for the poor in the fields. They are from deoraita only in Eretz Yisrael. And there is a machloket whether today it's deoraita or derabanan. Why does it matter if it's deoraita or derabanan? For the simple fact that a mitzvah miderabanan is a mitzvah that we just have to do. Now, we could learn from the mitzvah, but we do it. When it's a mitzvah mideoraita, there's a connection to Hashem. There's a hashgacha. The kedusha will be felt, just like Shabbos. When you bring Shabbat in, you feel Shabbat. You feel the kedusha because it's deoraita. Don't you want to feel the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael? I want to. We need Am Yisrael living here. So let's talk about today, the state of Eretz Yisrael today. Our sovereignty over the territories of the land of Israel revives the sanctity that we had and designated the chiyuv of the mitzvot hatliyot ba'aretz as deoraita, just like Maimonides wrote. But in order for us to fulfill the mitzvah of Shvi'it and Yovel from a Torah, all of Am Yisrael have to be here. To fulfill the mitzvah of Trumot u'Derabanan properly, even though we say it b'Shem u'Malchut, but to really feel it and to do it properly, mideoraita, we need a majority of Jews living in Eretz Yisrael. If we follow the opinion of those who believe that in the world now, how many Jews are in the world? I did a quick search. It's not exact, but according to the searches that I did, there are 14.7 million Jews living in the world today. In Israel, we have 45% of them. Okay? So the world's almost half of them live in Eretz Yisrael. So all we need, so right now Israel has I think 6,600,000, something like that. By my count, a quick calculation, we need another 800,000 Jews to have a Jewish majority in Eretz Yisrael. If that happens, then the laws of Trumot u'Ma'asot become deoraita. That means, just like we feel Shabbat, we will feel the mitzvah so much more. The connection to a Kohen, the connection to a Levi, the connection to the poor will be so true, like we feel Shabbat. But I just want to say that if I brought the beautiful thing that Rav Melamed discussed regarding ipuk and stuff, he says one more important aspect. He says that there's another way to count the number of Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. Jews whose parents were assimilated a few generations ago, figured the last 100 years. And if we do that calculation, it's not so hard to inquire who really had Jewish mothers and who did not. And the descendants of the Anusim, for instance, Jews who were forced to abandon Judaism against their will and have been assimilated throughout the ages. So approximately maybe 70 million Jews in the world. If that's a situation, we have a long way to have the majority of Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. I like to think of the simple way. So when will we be able to say that most of Am Yisrael live in Eretz Yisrael? I think we have to leave that to the courts. Leave it to the court of law, to the high Supreme Court to determine that. Either way, as the saying goes, mitzvah goreret mitzvah. Let us rejoice in our ability to fulfill such great, important mitzvot that allows us to form even more mitzvot. As we said, in Eretz Yisrael, the sachar that we get is real. I want to wish everybody a wonderful Tu B'Shvat Sameach. And may we continue to bring more Jews to the land of Israel, if not only just to have more Jews so that we can actually be committed to mitzvot ha'tluot ba'aretz that shine, that bring the best out of us. So Tu B'Shvat Sameach. I'm really looking forward to seeing all of you tomorrow at the Lechaim at 7 o'clock. So bring your wine or your grape juice or whatever you want to make a Lechaim with, and there will be a Tu B'Shvat quiz. And I'm really hoping to have a really great celebration, to celebrate Leil Tu B'Shvat, Perot Eretz Yisrael, that really give us a sense of a connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a connection to all of us living in Eretz Yisrael, and hopefully a sign, a tefillah, that all of Am Yisrael living abroad will come to Eretz Yisrael. So, Tu B'Shvat Sameach, and I hope to see everyone tomorrow.
Thank you.
Toda rabah.
Thank you. Thank you. Beautifully done. Thank you.
Toda.
Thank you very much, Bravo.
Toda rabah. I miss everyone so much, and Be'ezrat Hashem, hopefully we can see each other, soon. I didn't notice. Only now I'm noticing that Avram Samson is here, our president, our Nasi. It's wonderful, really, to see everybody here. Thank you so much, and I hope to on a celebration to see everyone tomorrow. Be'ezrat Hashem.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great
Thank
review of
you.
our history. Thank you.
Baruch Hashem.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye. Is this recorded?
Yes, it is recorded. It'll be up on the Shul website in a couple of days, I hope.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Rav Ote, and I think we've reached the end of the evening, so thank you very much.
Toda rabah. Thank you all again.
Thank you.